Back in the 1990s, I used to read books like this to learn Windows NT. At the time, Microsoft was betting its future on Windows servers. But when the company spent $400 million buying Hotmail in 1997, there was one awkward problem. Hotmail didn't run on Windows. The mid-1990s were a turning point for the technology industry. For years, most computing had taken place on a single machine sitting on a desk. Microsoft had built an empire around that model, with Windows running on millions of PCs around the world. But something new was beginning to emerge. The World Wide Web was connecting computers together in ways that had never been possible before. Software and services no longer had to live entirely on your own machine, and that presented a challenge to companies whose success had been built by the desktop. Inside Microsoft, people were beginning to realise just how important the internet was becoming. During 1995, senior executives were receiving warnings that key internet technologies were being developed outside of Microsoft's control, something the company was not used to. Then, in May 1995, Bill Gates sent a memo to the employees that would become famous inside the company. Titled The Internet Tidal Wave, it made one thing very clear: Microsoft needed to take the internet seriously. Gates described it as a development even more significant than the move to the graphical user interfaces, and from that point on, the company's priorities began to change. The concern was simple: if people started using applications that ran entirely inside a web browser, then the operating system underneath became far less important. For a company whose success depended on Windows, that represented a serious threat. Microsoft's response was to find ways of keeping the web tied closely to its own platforms and technologies, but while the company was rethinking its strategy, it was still struggling to win over internet users. Its online service MSN had failed to capture the public's imagination, while rivals such as AOL were rapidly becoming household names. By this point, Microsoft had already invested heavily in MSN. Huge sums had been spent building the service and the infrastructure behind it, but the results were disappointing. Despite the company's resources, MSN simply wasn't attracting enough users to justify the cost. Microsoft needed a different approach. It needed a service that could spread quickly, reach millions of consumers, and give the company a much stronger presence on the rapidly growing web. The story of Hotmail begins with one man, Sabir Bhatia. Born in India in 1968, he excelled academically and earned a scholarship to study electrical engineering at Caltech in California. He later continued his education at Stanford University, where he originally planned to pursue an academic career. That path changed when he was introduced to the world of entrepreneurship. A business course aimed at engineering students showed him that successful companies were often built on simple ideas, not just groundbreaking technology. It was a lesson that would soon shape the future of email. After graduating, Bhatia took engineering jobs at Apple and later Firepower Systems, but his goal was never simply to climb the corporate ladder. Instead, he wanted to understand how technology companies were built and what it would take to launch one of his own. While working at Apple, he met fellow engineer Jack Smith. The two would later reunite at Firepower Systems, where they began working on ideas for a web-based business application. They even registered the company name JavaSoft years before Sun Microsystems used the same name for its Java division. The idea for Hotmail came from a problem the two engineers were experiencing themselves. Firepower Systems had locked down its network with a corporate firewall preventing employees from accessing personal email accounts during the working day. Then, one evening, while driving home, Jack Smith had a realization. The firewall blocked email, but it didn't block normal web traffic. He called Sabir from the car phone and began explaining an idea for accessing email through a web page instead. According to Bhatia, he stopped Smith almost immediately and told him to call back when he got home. The idea was too important to discuss over a mobile phone. That night, Bhatia stayed up writing a new business plan, abandoning their database project and focusing entirely on web-based email. Convinced they'd stumbled across something valuable, Bhatia and Smith worked hard to keep the project secret. Along with their first employee, they operated from a small office across San Francisco Bay, while allowing outsiders to believe they were developing ordinary Java software. As the launch approached, Bhatia began carefully building interest in the product. He visited magazine editors one by one, giving them private demonstrations only after they had signed non-disclosure agreements. By the time Hotmail was ready to launch, word was beginning to spread that something significant was coming. Hotmail officially launched on July 4, 1996. The date was chosen deliberately. In the United States, Independence Day celebrates freedom, and Bhatia wanted Hotmail to represent a different kind of freedom. Freedom from being tied to a single internet provider or single computer. Coming up with a name proved surprisingly difficult. Jack Smith took on the task and spent an evening brainstorming ideas with his wife. Sitting in front of a blank sheet of paper, they wrote down dozens of names containing the word mail. There was Cool Mail, Run Mail, This Mail, That Mail, and plenty of others. None of them felt quite right. Then Smith's wife suggested Hotmail. Smith wasn't entirely convinced by the word hot, but it was better than anything else on the list. As he wrote it down, he noticed something interesting. Hidden within the name were the letters HTML, the language used to create the web pages. Suddenly, the name made perfect sense. Hotmail faced a challenge familiar to most startups. It had a great product, but very little money to spend on advertising. The solution was remarkably simple. Every email sent from Hotmail automatically included a short message at the bottom. Get your free email at Hotmail. The founders were initially concerned that users might object to having advertising attached to their personal messages, so they discussed the idea with their investors before rolling it out. The strategy was approved and the results were extraordinary. Every Hotmail user effectively became a salesperson for the service, helping it to spread across the internet at a speed that traditional marketing could never have achieved. The strategy worked better than anyone could have imagined. Every Hotmail user became a walking advertisement for the service. Each email carried an invitation to sign up, and recipients could create their own account in a few clicks. Growth quickly became explosive. At its peak, Hotmail was adding tens of thousands of new users every single day. Just 18 months after launch, the service had attracted around 10 million subscribers. At a time when there were only an estimated 35 million consumer email accounts in the entire world, Hotmail had captured more than a quarter of the market. Getting the business off the ground was far from easy. In late 1995, Batjer and Smith approached venture capital firm Dreiter Fisher Jurvetson, looking for funding to hire staff, build the service and market to the public. The investors liked the idea, but they were cautious. Free web services were largely untested and neither founder had experience of running a company. Instead of providing all the money they requested, the firm invested a smaller amount in exchange for a stake in the business. That decision forced Hotmail to operate on a very tight budget. With little money available for advertising, the company had to find other ways to grow, making its viral email footer not just clever marketing, but an essential part of its survival. By late 1997, Hotmail had millions of users, but there was one obvious problem. The service was free, and all of those users were costing money to support. Seeking additional funding, Sabir Bhatia approached entrepreneur and investor Kanwal Rekhi. Rekhi liked the growth, but he couldn't understand how the business would make money. His advice was simple: start charging users a monthly fee for email. Bhatia refused. He believed that the moment people had to pay, Hotmail's rapid growth would come to an end. Rekhi passed on the investment, arguing the company had no clear path to revenue. It would prove to be a very expensive decision. Not long afterwards, Rekhi changed his mind and decided he wanted to invest after all. But by then, events had overtaken him. While he was travelling in India, news broke that Microsoft was acquiring Hotmail. The opportunity had disappeared, leaving Rekhi on the sidelines of one of the biggest internet deals of the decade. It was now 1997. Hotmail had grown to more than 8 million users and was becoming impossible for the technology industry to ignore. The service had achieved in just over a year what many established companies were struggling to accomplish at all. Microsoft was paying close attention. Despite its dominance on the desktop, the company remained a distant competitor in the consumer internet market. Under the leadership of Laura Jennings at MSN, Microsoft began exploring the possibility of acquiring Hotmail and making it a key part of its online strategy. To Microsoft, Hotmail was more than just an email service. It was a chance to put millions of internet users inside the Microsoft ecosystem. The negotiations were anything but straightforward. Microsoft made an initial offer, but Bhatia rejected it, convinced that Hotmail was worth far more than the company was prepared to pay. Over the following weeks, Microsoft's offers steadily increased. Determined to reach an agreement, the company flew Bhatia to its headquarters in Redmond, Washington, for face-to-face negotiations. What followed was an intimidating experience. Bhatia found himself sitting across the table from a large Microsoft deal team, outnumbered by experienced corporate negotiators. On one side was one of the world's most powerful technology companies. On the other was a startup founder who believed his company's best days were still ahead of it. Bhatia later compared the experience to bargaining in an Indian marketplace. No matter how large the company sitting across the table, he believed the same basic rules applied. If you thought something was worth more, you had to be prepared to ask for it. So when Microsoft increased its offer, Bhatia responded with a much higher figure of his own. The reaction was immediate. According to Bhatia, members of Microsoft's negotiating team became furious. Voices were raised, tempers flared, and at one point the talks appeared to collapse completely. With no agreement in place, Bhatia left Redmond and flew back to Silicon Valley, unsure whether the deal was finished or whether Microsoft would return with another offer. The biggest pressure on Bhatia was not necessarily coming from Microsoft, it was coming from his own investors and board members. Many believed he was pushing too hard and risking the entire deal. Several investors warned that Microsoft was already offering far more than most startups could ever hope to achieve, and that demanding significantly more might cause the company to walk away altogether. When Bill Gates personally approved a new offer, Hotmail's management team gathered to discuss their options. A quick vote revealed an overwhelming consensus. Most believed the offer was simply too good to refuse. There was just one problem. Subir Bhatia wasn't going to be convinced. Despite the recommendations of his board and his investors, he refused to accept the offer. Years later, he would describe it as the most frightening decision of his life. If Microsoft walked away, he risked losing everything. Microsoft attempted to increase the pressure, with reports emerging that the company was also considering a deal with Hotmail's rival, Rocketmail. But Bhatia believed Microsoft needed Hotmail more than Hotmail needed Microsoft, and he refused to back down. In the end, his gamble paid off. On New Year's Eve, 1997, Microsoft agreed to acquire Hotmail in a deal worth around $400 million of Microsoft stock. At just 28 years old, Subir Bhatia had become one of the Silicon Valley's newest success stories. Buying Hotmail was only the beginning. Integrating it into Microsoft was a much bigger challenge. The problem was that Hotmail had been built using technologies that Microsoft didn't control. The service ran on a mixture of Unix-based systems, with Apache web servers handling the front end and other Unix servers managing the email infrastructure behind the scenes. For Microsoft, this created an awkward situation. The company had just spent hundreds of millions of dollars acquiring one of the most successful services on the internet, only to discover that it was running on software that competed directly with Microsoft's own server products. For Microsoft, the situation was becoming increasingly embarrassing. Here was one of the company's most important internet services handling millions of users, yet it was running on FreeBSD and Apache rather than Microsoft's own Exchange server. At the time when Microsoft was actively promoting Windows NT as the future of enterprise computing, that was not a message the company wanted to send. Internally, a decision was made that Hotmail would eventually be migrated onto Microsoft's own technology stack. The initiative became part of Microsoft's long-standing philosophy of eating its own dog food by using its own products in real-world production environments. If Microsoft expected customers to trust Windows for large-scale internet services, then Microsoft itself would have to do the same. The migration quickly exposed a problem that had little to do with email and everything to do with operating system design. Windows NT and later Windows 2000 had been created for a world where administrators typically managed a small number of servers through a graphical interface. Hotmail was a very different challenge. It consisted of thousands of machines that needed to be deployed, updated, monitored and maintained at internet scale. The engineers coming from a Unix background were accustomed to managing large server farms through command line tools and automated scripts. By comparison, many Windows administration tasks still relied heavily on graphical management tools, making large-scale automation far more difficult. This was years before PowerShell and modern automation frameworks would transform Windows administration, leaving Microsoft's engineers with a significant challenge to overcome. Then there was another problem. The FreeBSD systems used by Hotmail had been configured for a very specific purpose. They were lean, efficient, and contained only components needed to run the service. Windows was a different beast. A standard installation included a large number of services, background processes and operating system components, many of which depended on one another in ways that were not always obvious. For the engineers responsible for the migration, this created a difficult question. Which part of Windows were actually required, and which could be safely removed to improve performance? At Hotmail's scale, even small amounts of wasted memory or processor time multiplied across thousands of servers could have a significant impact. The migration also highlighted a major difference in philosophy between Unix and Windows systems. On the Unix servers that powered Hotmail, important configuration settings were often stored in plain text files that could be viewed and edited. Administrators generally knew exactly where to look when they wanted to understand how the system was behaving. Windows took a different approach. Many critical settings were buried within the registry or other internal configuration databases, making them harder to inspect and modify directly. For engineers accustomed to complete visibility of control, this was deeply uncomfortable. They needed to understand exactly how the platform was making decisions, yet many of those decisions were hidden behind layers of abstraction. The challenges proved far more difficult to overcome than Microsoft had anticipated. Years after the acquisition, the migration was still incomplete. In June 2001, Microsoft publicly announced that Hotmail had been successfully moved onto its own platform. The celebration was short-lived. Within days, independent analysis revealed that key parts of the service were still relying on FreeBSD and Solaris systems behind the scenes, forcing Microsoft to walk back its claims. Even by 2002, Hotmail was operating as a hybrid environment. The web servers visible to the users had largely been moved onto Windows, but critical back-end systems remained on Unix. The reality was that migrating one of the world's largest email services was proving far more complicated than simply installing Windows and flipping a switch. In 1997, Hotmail was growing at an astonishing rate, adding thousands of users every day. Then, one night, disaster struck. An overnight maintenance program known as the Janitor was designed to empty deleted email from users' trash folders, but a software bug caused multiple janitors to run at the same time, and instead of cleaning out the trash, they began deleting messages from users' inboxes. By the time the problem was stopped, around 25% of Hotmail users had lost their email. The situation became even worse when the team discovered that regular tape backups had recently been discontinued due to cost. Much of the missing data was simply gone. For a young company built on trust, it was a nightmare. Yet, despite the outage, Hotmail survived, continued to grow, and just weeks later, Microsoft completed its acquisition. In August 1999, Hotmail suffered one of the most serious security failures in the history of the web. A group calling itself Hackers Unite discovered a flaw in the service that effectively bypassed normal account security, allowing access to others' email accounts. The group leaked details of the vulnerability to the media as a protest against what they saw as Microsoft's growing dominance of the software industry. News of the flaw spread rapidly around the world, raising concerns about the security of tens of millions of Hotmail users. Microsoft moved quickly and deployed a fix within hours, but the damage to Hotmail's reputation had already been done. At the time, some commentators described it as the most widespread security incident the web had ever seen. Security expectations on the early internet were very different from those we take for granted today. Account recovery often relied on simple security questions such as the make of your first car or the name of a favourite pet. The problem was that many of these answers were easy to guess, discover or obtain through social engineering. As a result, unauthorised access to email accounts became surprisingly common, particularly for public figures whose personal details were often already known. It was another reminder that while web-based email was revolutionary, the security practices needed to protect the millions of users were still evolving. The acquisition may have been a financial success, but it marked the end of an era for Hotmail's founders. Sabir Bhatia and Jack Smith both joined Microsoft after the deal, taking senior roles in the company, but the transition from a fast-moving startup to one of the world's largest corporations was not an easy one. At Hotmail, major decisions could be made in minutes. At Microsoft, they often involved layers of management, planning and process. Bhatia in particular found the environment frustrating, feeling that the speed and energy that had helped create Hotmail were difficult to maintain inside a large organisation. Within a year, both founders had moved on to pursue new ventures, bringing their chapter in the Hotmail story to a close. Several years after the acquisition, Hotmail remained one of the most important services on the internet. Microsoft integrated it with products such as MSN Messenger and Microsoft Passport, helping to build a much broader online ecosystem around millions of users. Then in 2004, a new challenger arrived. Google launched Gmail with a staggering 1 gigabyte of storage, far more than most webmail users were accustomed to receiving. Combined with fast search capabilities and a highly responsive interface, Gmail immediately changed expectations of what web-based email could be. Looking back, Sabir Bhatia argued that Microsoft underestimated the importance of increasing storage for free users. Whether or not that was the decisive factor, Gmail's arrival marked the beginning of a major shift in the webmail market and ended Hotmail's position as the uncontested leader. Microsoft's response was a complete modernization of its web platform. In 2012, the company launched Outlook.com, and by 2013, the Hotmail brand had been retired. Although the name disappeared, millions of @hotmail.com email addresses remain active to this day. Perhaps the most interesting part of the story is Hotmail's long-term impact on Microsoft itself. The challenges of running one of the world's largest email services forced the company to rethink how Windows servers, large-scale infrastructure, and the internet services were designed and operated. In many ways, Hotmail became an early proving ground for the technologies and operational experience that would later underpin Microsoft's global data center network. The service that Microsoft acquired to compete on the web ultimately helped lay some of the foundations for the cloud platforms that followed, including Microsoft Azure.